Dubious ones, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about frame gen and specifically Nvidia's offerings with frame generation, Nvidia Reflex, and their whole software suite. As someone who has been playing with this software, has a 5070 Ti, and has been utilizing this software for many months now. And I wanted to clear up some of the misconceptions that you guys may have from some of the big YouTubers out there I've seen reviewing these cards, saying fake frames this, fake frames that, and I'm going to tell you why I think they're all wrong and why I love this software, so buckle up. This is going to be an unscripted video, just shooting off the cuff, getting some things off my chest for you guys. So I'm going to play some Marvel Rivals gameplay in the background for you guys while we go over this, just some random Marvel Rivals gameplay, all being played with frame generation on, Nvidia DLSS, set to like ultra quality, on those kinds of things. So we are playing, most of these videos you're going to see, we're playing on the ultra settings at 1440p. I have a 360 hertz refresh rate monitor, QD OLED monitor, beautiful screen, beautiful display, and for me, since I bought the 5070 Ti, I wanted, not the greatest start to this game for me, but I wanted it to, be able to take advantage of my monitor's beautiful refresh rates. Now, I couldn't afford a 5090, which is what I initially wanted, nor could I afford a 4090, as prices on those went way up after the 50 series launch, and we found out that the next best card in the series, the 5080, couldn't even touch the 4090, which is different from prior generations. So it was a little disappointing there. But as far as Nvidia's offerings, we know they promised 4090 performance on a 5070. Well, that turned out to be fake news. Now, the reason for that is that they were talking about frame gen. Now, one of the biggest things you're going to hear when people tell you about the downsides of frame generation is obviously the input lag and the input latency that you're going to feel when you're playing a game. So let me give you the base case for when you want to use frame gen. Now, frame gen is wonderful for games where you already have a base frame rate of, say, 70, 80 FPS, and then you can turn on frame gen, whether it's ×2, ×3, ×4, you're fine as long as you're using Nvidia Reflex. Nvidia Reflex will turn a 4x frame gen scenario at your base frame rate. Remember, your base frame rate, say it's 70 or 80 FPS, it will turn your regular input lag that you would feel with no Nvidia Reflex on, so what we've been used to for the last 25 years in gaming, higher refresh rates, lower input lag, right? So with Nvidia Reflex, it's going to reduce your latency with or without frame gen on, but it will make even up to 4x frame gen, which is supposed to give you this massive input lag that people freak out about. It'll actually reduce that input lag to lower than what you would be at base without Nvidia Reflex on at a 70 or 80 FPS. So let's say your regular latency, if you didn't have Nvidia Reflex on at all, and you were playing a game at, say, 80 FPS, say your input lag, and we're talking mouse and keyboard, not controller, because controller adds its own input lag, but if you have an input lag of, say, 50 at base, well, then Nvidia Reflex with frame gen on ×4 at the maximum, where it adds the most input lag or latency, it would drop that down to about a 40. So normally at, say, 80 FPS, you're getting an input lag of like at 50 at base for a regular game that you're playing, whether it's an FPS or anything, and it feels fine, feels smooth, feels great. Well, now you turn on frame gen ×4, your frames are jumping up to, say 200 FPS. But your input lag has actually gone down from what it would feel like at that 80 FPS of like a 50 down to a 40. Now, if you use Nvidia Reflex with no frame gen, then it can bring down your latency as low as like a 10 or a 2. Like, it can bring down it so significantly. But if you are used to playing high refresh rate and high FPS games, say you're a Counter-Strike player or any FPS, a COD player or anything, and you're used to having, you set all your settings to low to get a higher refresh rate, the input lag that you're going to feel at that super high refresh rate is still going to be more than you're going to feel with Nvidia Reflex if you were to crank those graphics up. And I would argue to say that the input lag you feel at, 100 FPS, 90, 100 FPS, or the input lag you feel at a base frame rate, we're talking no frame gen, just in the past, what we've always felt with a higher refresh rate monitor. I'd argue the input lag you feel with mouse and keyboard, at least for 90+% of the population out there, whatever you have at 80, 90 FPS feels fine. Once you get up to 200 FPS, 300 FPS, you're not noticing a difference. It's not a perceivable difference that the average person is going to feel. If you're in that top 1 percentile, maybe you'll notice it slightly, but I would argue over 90% of the gaming player base, myself included, I don't feel a difference between a base 80, 90 FPS and a base 300 FPS if you tank your graphics settings low to get that lower input lag and that higher FPS. So, with FrameGen's not, when it boosts you up to 200 or 300 FPS, the difference is it's not lowering your input lag, which is what raw raster performance does do. So you're not getting that input latency that you would get at a normal 200 FPS or whatever. So that's why people are saying it feels weird, right? So if you're used to using AMD's FrameGen or other various FrameGen technologies out there, without Nvidia Reflex, you really actually do notice that latency because it's also bringing your base frame rate down. So if your base frame rate is, say, a 10 FPS, and you're using FrameGen to get like 30, 40 FPS, your input lag, even with Nvidia Reflex, is still going to be based around that 10 FPS, and it's going to feel weird. And that's what people are talking about. But if you're able to get a base FPS of over 60, 70, even 80 FPS, if you can get that as your base, and then you're turning FrameGen on, I'm going to tell you right now, as someone who's been using it for many months now, on the 5070 Ti, you're not going to notice a thing. It's going to feel buttery smooth, it's going to feel incredible. So for me, when I play a game like Marvel Rivals, right now my FPS, because of FrameGen, I have everything at max graphics here, and I've got a 258 FPS right now. 316 FPS right now. To me, this looks buttery smooth. I'm not seeing any aberrations on the screen. I'm not seeing a lot of the distortion and noise that you would normally see because this is a fast-paced game. If I was playing a much slower-paced game, a single-player game, for instance, then maybe I don't want 4x FrameGen. But when I'm playing a fast-paced game like this, and I have a 360 Hz refresh rate monitor, but it's a beautiful QD OLED, I still want my beautiful ultra-setting graphics. Like, this looks incredible to me. And because of Nvidia Reflex, again, the input lag, because my base frame rate is probably at about a 90 or 100, I don't feel any additional input lag whatsoever. And again, with Nvidia Reflex, it's bringing it down from what it would be at that 100 FPS as is at base. So I'm still getting better FPS, but no, am I getting the same input latency I would have if I had a 300 Hertz FPS? No. But again, I'm arguing majority of players can't feel the difference between the input lag you'd have at a base 100 FPS or a base 300 FPS. Very few people would notice a perceivable difference, especially if you play on controller, because those add their own input latency. That on a controller, you're already at a higher input lag than you would be on mouse and keyboard as is. So things like Nvidia Reflex are only working magic behind the scenes for you guys. So I really just think for those of you shopping for different cards out there, you really need to start looking at the software side of things, as that's what I had to do this generation. When researching my 5070 Ti, I wanted the best bang for my buck. A 5080 was just out of the price range. It wasn't worth nearly double the price of the 5070 Ti, and that's what it was for like the cheapest one when I was shopping for this. It wasn't worth the price difference for the marginal increase in performance. And same thing with a 4090. 4090 is still a fantastic card, but I couldn't find one at a reasonable price towards the performance I would be getting. A 5090, again, way out of the price range, definitely wasn't worth huge, great performance gain, but definitely was not worth the price increase versus the performance gain I'd get. For me, I've been very happy with FrameGen. For me, I'm running a 1440p monitor, not a 4K 260 Hz or 360 Hz. I'm running a 1440p 360 Hz, and I want to be able to push those refresh rates. Do I care that right now with 4x FrameGen, I'm getting 288 FPS instead of 360? No. I can't tell the difference. My eyes cannot tell the difference between 250 FPS and 350 FPS, if I'm being honest. I got the 360 hertz monitor because it's what it was. It was the newest QD OLED on the market at the time, and it looks great, and I'm very happy with my purchase. Do I care that I'm not pushing 360 hertz? No. I would rather have my ultra graphics settings here with frame gen on all the way and getting 300 FPS than I would tanking my graphics and pushing it above that 360 hertz. Again, Nvidia Reflex is what's working the magic behind the scenes, as my input lag is lower with Nvidia Reflex on and 4x frame gen than I would be at that same frame rate if I had no Nvidia Reflex on. Do you know what I mean? So it's incredible what Reflex is able to do. Now Reflex is also able to do this without frame gen on. So you can have the lowest input latency you've ever seen in a video game, period. And say, so if you're on a 5090 and you can push max graphics settings at 4K and still get over 200, 300 FPS, turn NVIDIA Reflex on and all of a sudden, like, the input latency just, it doesn't exist, right? It's like, it's fractional. And if you turned frame gen on times 4, you still wouldn't notice the difference because the input latency is already so low that it's not perceivable to 90+% of the population. And I just want people to know, don't go out there buying a 50-50 and thinking 4x frame gen is going to save you, because it won't, because your base frame rate still needs to be, I'd say you're looking at roughly 60 FPS is what you'd want as your base case, and remembering that frame gen is going to reduce that base frame rate a little bit. So I'd say if you're sitting in a game at about 70 FPS, then maybe bump it up. Maybe bump that up to from 70 FPS. Maybe bump that, or like maybe make sure you're at a point where you're 70 is probably a safe point. 70, 80 FPS as your base. Then turn frame gen on times 4. Then you're hitting your 200, 300 FPS, and you will not notice any latency in your input whatsoever if you have Reflex turned on. That's what I'm telling you. Again, if your base frame rate is 30 or below, you're going to have the input lag of 30 or below. Reflex will bring it down to a little bit lower than that, but it's still not going to be as good as it would be as if your base frame rate was at 60. Again, that'll still apply. If your base frame rate was 300, obviously that input latency is going to be better than if your base frame rate was 100 with or without NVIDIA Reflex. But NVIDIA Reflex pretty much eliminates every downside to frame gen, and that's what people don't talk about, is that Reflex is such a good technology that you can have the added input lag of a 4x frame gen, which before, I had used frame gen before I had Reflex on AMD cards. It felt bad because my base frame rate, A, wasn't high enough and I didn't have Reflex. So I was getting higher latency, no Reflex to counteract that, and getting the higher frame rate, and it just felt weird. You don't have that feeling weird when you're using Reflex and frame gen on the NVIDIA series cards this generation. I cannot, again, speak for a 5060 Ti or a 5060 or a 5050. Those cards might not feel as good because, again, your base frame rate, I wouldn't want it below 60 FPS if I'm going to turn on frame gen. Just because of the base input lag is already going to be at 30 FPS. Doesn't feel great. So if you magically have buttery smooth frames and you have that same 30 FPS input lag, it doesn't feel right. But once you go above 60 and 70, I'm telling you, 80 FPS as what your base input latency would be, and then Reflex brings that down a little bit from where it would be there, and you turn on that 4x frame gen, my goodness. Then it feels incredible and it looks gorgeous. Again, we're sitting at, 248 FPS here. Max graphics, everything looks beautiful, and it feels snappy and responsive. So I just wanted to get this out there for you guys because so many people out there where I've heard so much talk that it's not worth it. It's fake frames. You should never use frame gen. There's no situations in a competitive game where you should ever use frame gen. And I argue that's all BS for 90% of the gaming population. If you're not try-harding for a tournament, and you're like in that top 1% where every little advantage you can get counts, just use NVIDIA Reflex, turn on your frame gen till you've got a frame rate that hits your monitor's max refresh rate. Again, just make sure your base frame rate that you're getting before you start, I'd say is at about a 70. If it's above that and you have Reflex turned on, you're not going to notice anything. It's going to feel great. It's going to look great. It's buttery smooth. Again, if I'm playing a single player only game, maybe I'll notice the artifacting, shimmering things from the frame gen at 4x. So maybe I'd turn it down to a 2x. You know what I mean? Just a regular base frame gen. If I would notice graphically in a slower paced game. But for me so far, even in slower paced games, I mean, I don't play a lot of super slow paced games, but even in those games, when I have frame gen on, I'm still happy at 2, 3, 4x. It never bothers me. I'm not noticing all this shimmering and artifacting and everything that people would pause and show you a specific frame of like Cyberpunk and stuff like that. Like, I watched all the videos and everyone poo-pooed all over frame gen and was acting like it was the worst technology of all time. You should never use it. It's fake frames. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who's used this tech for months, I have it on all the time. I use Reflex and I have it on all the time. But again, my base frame rate is already good. My base frame rate at ultra settings is still going to be close to 100 FPS, 90, 80 FPS. So I'm not suffering from trying to uplift from 20 or 30 FPS and trying to uplift that to 60 or 70. Because that's where you're going to have the issues where it doesn't feel good. So I definitely would recommend the Nvidia's 50 series of cards, at least the 5070 Ti from what I have. I definitely recommend that to people out there looking. For me, it was cheaper a little bit than the 9070 XT at my computer shop. I understand the 9070 XT is supposed to be cheaper, and it should be, because performance-wise, raw raster, they're about even. So I would have gone with whatever was cheaper, if not for all the software on Nvidia's side this generation. To me, Reflex is the greatest technology. Like, it's just amazing. It's fantastic. It does exactly what it says. It lowers your input latency massively. So you can use something like a 4x frame gen and feel exactly the same. You don't notice a difference when you turn on frame gen. So yeah, I definitely recommend it to anyone who's out there questioning it, unsure. DLSS's upgrades and everything with the 50 series, fantastic. DLSS is incredible. All these games that you're seeing, I believe I'm running DLSS ultra quality, like the highest level of DLSS without it just being native. Whatever that was called, Marvel Rivals, I forget off the top of my head. And again, we're at 260 FPS right now. Everything looks good. I'm not noticing artifacting. Maybe you can see it on the video if you pause it or you go back. But in-game, while I'm playing it, I don't notice it at all. So I would always want to play with this higher refresh rate, for me personally, because it feels buttery smooth. Anyways, that was about it. Just a little bit of a rant because I have lots of people telling me in my testing videos for some of my my benchmarks that I did with Marvel Rivals a while back. People were telling me how, you know, faked frames, frame gen, Nvidia Reflex, yeah, this is blah, 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 this, because they were trying to help me get inches and like an extra 10 FPS at like 1440p low settings. And I'm like, no. The reason I ran this benchmark was because someone asked me to without frame gen, but I am 100% behind frame gen. And they were trying to explain to me the downsides of frame gen as if I didn't already know them and researched all that myself before buying it. And this is someone who doesn't own a 5070 Ti, who's not using it on a daily basis, right? Trying to tell me the downsides of the technology I'm using on a daily basis. So that was kind of the point of this video, was just to point out there, to try and maybe clear up some of the misconceptions that some people have of this technology. I think it's amazing. Nvidia definitely won this generation, in my opinion. That's why I switched from an AMD card to a 50 series card this time around, because I just think Reflex, DLSS, and Nvidia's frame gen is just better in every perceivable metric than Intel or AMD's offerings of the same kind of technology, right? It may not be a lot. They might close the gap soon, but this generation, I definitely think the 50 series got it. So if you're out there wondering which cards to get, I'd always go by a price to performance for your whatever your price point is. Evaluate price to performance. Would you use frame gen? Maybe the 9070 XT is a better card for you because it's just a lot cheaper where you are. But for me, the 5070 Ti was actually a little bit cheaper. And even if it was about $100 more, I still would have bought it because of the tech behind it. But that's just me. And apparently this guy is lagging out because he just didn't want to die. But anyways, dubious ones. I hope, as you can see again, all these videos you're seeing on screen, this is frame gen ×4 on ultra settings. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like in game. And I can tell you, I promise you, the input latency was non-existent for me. Anytime I've ever used it, I've never moved around and been like, oh, that feels off. Never once. So I definitely recommend it, but if you're on a weaker card, like a 5050, 5060, 5060 Ti, I can't promise you the same performance because your base frame rate, again, I wouldn't want it below 70 FPS if I was going to use FrameGen. Just throwing that out there. I haven't been able to push it to the point where I'm way below that, but from everything I've heard and everything else, I wouldn't recommend turning on FrameGen if you're below, I'd say at least 60 FPS as a base, for it to not feel a little weird and maybe have a little bit of the input latency. But as long as you're above that, you're fine, man. Anyways, dubious ones, appreciate y'all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave me your comments in the comment section down below. I appreciate y'all for watching, and again, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Till the next one, deuces.